In regards to the rideshare strike, Valentine's Day, there's some positive news, at least if you ask yours truly, coming out in regards to drivers seeking transparency. What up, folks? Once again, it is indeed your boy Tim with another ride sharing video. Now, I've said in every video that I've posted in regards to analyzing what could come from the strike, what would be the goal of drivers, transparency. Fact is, a lot of the issues that drivers have that they want addressed from both Uber, Lyft, and the gig economy in general are not known by passengers or the public at large. Simply put, the truth could set us free. Simply letting folks know what the hell is going on, such as rideshare companies stealing tips or taking an absorbent amount of the fare. Just getting that information out has value in itself. And here is a positive article coming from that. And look who it is from. This article is titled, "How Often Do Uber and Lyft Customers Tip Their Drivers? Maybe Less Than You Think." Now, tipping is obviously important to the drivers, considering how lackluster the fares can be once they take their 50, 60, 70% out of it. But a lot of passengers don't know that the tips are so important to drivers, and certainly they probably never have been aware that Uber has been accused and had to settle out of court for stealing tips outright. But listen to how the article continues in regards to how few passengers tip. And this is valuable information to get out there in the form of transparency to passengers and the public at large for drivers hoping to get some type of gain from that strike. Only some 28% of rideshare trips result in tips, according to a recently released report by Gridwise Analytics, which operates an app that tracks earnings for 500,000 active rideshare and delivery drivers. So 500,000 is a decent sized data set, but I want you to hear how this goes on, because it's actually going to get worse. And that's a good thing, because they explain it in detail, and I do believe it helps out in transparency for folks who don't actually know what the hell's going on. Now, the biggest benefit from this is a CBS Market Watch article, and that means it is a national article. Folks around the country, are exposed to Market Watch articles. This is not a local CBS affiliate in some town. This is something that could appear anywhere CBS media appears, including local affiliates. So this will have a large audience and a lot of exposure. And if we want transparency, that's exactly what we want. Now, here are the numbers. 28% of rideshare fares or rideshare trips result in a tip. I believe that's basically accurate. I've said before, 20 to 30% of passengers tip. A lot of passengers don't realize that. A lot of passengers think drivers are making a hell of a lot of money. This article will go into further detail, certainly dispelling that theory, but the idea that only 28% tip has another sinister overtone to it. Fact is, that is exactly what Uber wants, and the article is going to tell you why. Uber does not want drivers to receive big tips, a lot of tips, or a good amount of money in tips, because they don't make any money if a driver is happy and goes home. A lot of drivers have a set minimum or set maximum that they're trying to earn for the day, and once they make that, they'll go home to be with their family, wife and kids, you name it. So if a driver goes out there and they want to earn $250 for the day and they're good to go. Remember, as an independent contractor, you can go home whenever the hell you want. So if a driver goes out there and is trying to get a $250 earnings for the day and gets a bunch of tips and reaches that 250 mark in, say, 4 or 5 hours, they may go home. That may increase the likelihood that they're satisfied financially for the day and may go home. Uber wants you to drive as long as possible because they're making a profit off the trips. They don't make shit off the tips. So there's no incentive for Uber for the drivers to be tipped handsomely. In fact, it's a way to disincentivize Uber to have a driver receiving a bunch of tips. Because as I stated, they may go home sooner, which is a disadvantage to Uber. They don't want you receiving a lot of tips, but that's not just coming from me. The article is going to explain it a little bit better. And keep in mind, several years went by, despite the urging and pleading from both drivers and passengers, before Uber allowed tipping to take place. Yours truly, when I started driving back in 2014, I had a hell of a lot of passengers continuing to complain, why can't we tip you? Why doesn't the app let us tip you? Could you stop at an ATM? I don't have any cash on me. I want to give you a few bucks. It's a nice car. You're a nice driver. Good conversation. I don't know why the hell they don't let us tip you through the app. Took about 10 years, according to this article, before Uber allowed that to happen. I personally remember 2017's around the time in my market they started letting tips take place. But the article will state it in more detail and give the statement credibility. For nearly a decade, Uber didn't enable users to tip, and consumers have gotten used to not tipping for that type of service. Ryan Green, CEO of Gridwise, told CBS Market Watch. We saw some of the high fares when it's more than $1,000, but zero tip, and that's for 6 hours of driving. And that's another big issue. When you get long trips, which I'm strongly against because I don't believe long trips are profitable, namely for shit like this, where you take a passenger, and I'm sure some of my veteran drivers can back this up because we've all experienced it, where you're driving a passenger 30 minutes, 2 hours, in this case, 6 hours to their destination. They get out of the vehicle and they don't tip your shit. Every single rideshare driver in the business has had passengers like this. Maybe not a passenger that involved a $1,000 fare, but at least one that involved a $50, $100, $300 fare. Every driver in the business has had this. Because that's how we find out a lot of times this shit happens, is that you get a long trip, you feel like, yay, I'm about to make a bunch of money. And then when you do it, you look at what your take is and you're like, this is really fucked up. So this article really does a good job in exposing the fact that a CEO of a third-party organization had a data sample of 500,000 drivers and saw some trips where the passenger paid $1,000. The driver drove 6 hours, and that passenger did not tip that driver 1 single cent. Now, we know in the restaurant business, let's say the bar and club business, folks regularly tip. In the restaurant business, you tip 20% of the cost of a meal, 18, 15, 20% of what your tab is. You generally tip that in the restaurant business. Now, we don't expect someone to tip 20% of $1,000 fare. But zero. You know why that is? As the article states, passengers, because Uber banned tipping for nearly a decade, it destroyed the tipping culture in passenger transport. Now, keep in mind, for you folks who are old enough to remember riding in taxis and cabs, everybody tipped back then. Even if it was $1 or $2, everyone was tipping when they rode in a taxi or a cab back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s until this shit came along. If you catch a shuttle at the airport, maybe from the parking lot to the terminal, or however you may catch a shuttle, maybe from the terminal or where you arrive to your hotel, folks still tip quite frequently in those businesses because their employer, their contractor never banned tipping for so damn long. I would submit to you, if you started telling restaurant patrons you don't have to tip and the waitress is not expecting a tip, first of all, you would bring down the amount of tipping in the restaurant business. And if you do that for 10 years and then you start allowing people to tip again, you're going to really mess up tipping culture in the restaurant business. That's exactly what happened here, is that Uber screwed it up. And I'm not saying Lyft, because Lyft didn't start that way. But Uber, which is the grandfather of ride sharing, fucked up the tipping culture. And that still exists to this day, even though they now allow tipping. Keep in mind, as I stated earlier, because Uber makes no benefit or has no benefit coming from passengers tipping. In fact, it's actually not good for Uber if passengers tip, because drivers may go home. Because of that, Uber caps how much you can tip. So this case where a driver drove someone on $1,000 fare, 6 hours of driving, I believe the most that passenger could tip that driver was $28. I believe they do cap it. In some cases, it's even lower than that. Why the hell would a rideshare company prevent a passenger from showing one of the drivers some love? That never existed in the taxi business. Absolutely. There was no disincentivizing passengers to tip. But as I stated, Uber has something to gain in drivers not receiving tips, and they've operated that way from day one. And this article certainly covers that. Now, between 2022 and 2023, the article goes on to say that the gross earnings of drivers dropped by 17%. That's fairly significant for a single year. So you can see from what I'm stating, and the article will back it up. Here goes. We can see directly how their earnings have been constructed in a way to be compressed when the prices of all goods, the cost of living is substantially higher. Now, when they say compressed, that's what I'm talking about when I suggest they don't want you being tipped. We want drivers to earn very little because it keeps them out on the road. If you're out there making a bunch of money, you might go home sooner, and that is of no advantage to Uber. I don't want to go throwing out the slave word, but that's kind of what's going on here. The more you work, the better off I am. So I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you work as long as I want you to, even if it's not necessarily that profitable to you. Transparency is valuable, folks, because this is something else all of us drivers know, but it's really good to have a major news outlet like CBS telling this to folks that have nothing to do with rideshare, or the occasional passenger thinking that drivers are making a killing when they're taking them from point A to point B. This is good information. And last but not least, it actually gives the readers a little bit more detail on exactly what we're talking about. Typically, Lyft and Uber collect an average of roughly 40% of fares, Green said. Lyft earlier this month vowed that its drivers would receive at least 70% of fares. Now, I'm going to start out by saying I don't believe that's actually true. I think that Uber takes a little bit more than 40%. But let's go with that. Let's not try to dispel that or speak ill of that. Most passengers don't believe or don't realize they're taking 40%. That's a lot, folks. If you're taking a $10 trip as a passenger, to think the driver's only getting 6 of that. If you just randomly ask a passenger out of the blue, okay, your trip costs $10. How much do you believe the drivers are getting? I don't think most passengers would even come close to saying 6. They would probably say between $8 and $9. After all, it's the driver's car, the driver's fuel, the driver's insurance, the driver's risk of getting hit, robbed, you name it. Why would the ride-sharing companies take 40% of the fare? Where is the justification for that? I don't believe most passengers know. Thanks to CBS Market Watch for telling at least its readers and viewers. And we'll be continuing on with other content because it's going for obviously far more than just CBS Market Watch. But I saw this article written less than 24 hours after the strike. So that's really good in terms of exposure and gaining transparency, particularly from only a one-day strike. So once again, in conclusion to the video here, shout out to Torsten. This actually is beneficial to drivers. So shout out to Torsten for initiating this one-day strike in ride sharing. And he's certainly promising to not only do it again, which I certainly agree with, but expand it globally to more countries. Right now, we're looking at the UK, Canada, and the United States are the participants from yesterday's strike. But he's talking about expanding it. So shout out to Torsten for doing that. Let your boy know in the comments, have you seen any other valuable articles getting this point out? And real quick, just for other folks reading or watching the content that may be outside of the ride sharing world, what percentage of your passengers tip? If you're an Uber or Lyft driver, what is your analysis in regards to tipping? What percentage of your passengers tip you? Just so other viewers would know. Subscribe to the channel, smash that like button. I will certainly see you in the next video.